All right, welcome to the afternoon sessions of the conference. We now begin the treatment of the view from outside China and the impact of BRI as seen and perceived by countries, states, societies beyond the confines of the People's Republic of China. My name is Alan Lynch. I teach in the politics department here at UVA. I'm a Russian scholar. I have an interest, more than a peripheral interest, in these proceedings. In the interest of time, I'm just going to briefly introduce the speakers and then turn the panel over to them. Before I do, there was mention of the Sri Lankan case earlier as one of the failures of perhaps of the BRI program. But, you know, Sri Lanka used to be called Ceylon. And we have a word in English called serendipity. So serendipity is when different things come together in an almost magical way, and they produce a result that is much greater than the sum of the individual parts that no one could have anticipated before. It's like win, 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 right? Serendipity. Serendip was the Arabic name for Ceylon 1,000 years ago, when Ceylon was one of the central trading posts between China and the West through the intermediary of Arabic and South Asian traders. So that may give us an element perhaps of hope, maybe thinking of Professor Harding's invocation toward eventual partnership, or at least that positive sum games are possible. So, having said that, the first to speak, the topic, South and Central Asian Perspectives, my colleague Shawn Lyons, who is a dean in the College of Arts and Sciences, and he teaches here in the Department of Middle Eastern Studies. Shawn's PhD is in Central Asian Studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He teaches courses here on Central Asia. I know in the past he's taught courses on Uzbek history, for instance, but also culture and literature. He's published in journal outlets such as Central Asian Studies, Inner Asia, amongst others. And he'll be talking to us about the title, Fanfare and Dismay, China's Belt and Road Initiative Throughout Uzbek Media. I'll introduce John, and then I'll give the floor to you, Shawn. My colleague here, John Etcheverry-Gent, teaches in my own department of politics. His own PhD, if I recall from graduation ceremonies, is the University of Chicago, correct? Yes, even though I'm colorblind, I figured that out. John's focus is on the political economy of development and comparative public policy. He's been a MacArthur and Fulbright scholar. He's also, for many years, been the treasurer of the American Institute of Indian Studies. I myself am a co-treasurer of a Geneva Graduate Institute, so I am full of sympathy for his commitment and misery. John's the author of books that include Economic Reform in Three Giants, U.S. Foreign Policy and the Soviet Union, China and India, as well as The State and the Poor, Public Policy and Political Development in India and the United States. He currently has a book manuscript in progress, Politics of Markets, Political Economy of India's Financial Markets Development in Comparative Perspective. So I've read their presentations, and you have much to look forward to. So without further delay, I give you my colleague, Shawn Lyons.
Well, good afternoon. When I was invited to participate on this panel last semester, I believe, and I obviously accepted the invitation, I realized that generally speaking, Uzbek language articles on One Belt, One Road were precisely the articles I tended to ignore. And I ignored them because they so often remind me of Soviet socialist novels in which it is inevitable that the great road, the great new tunnel, the great new cement factory is going to be constructed, thanks to the wise guidance of our dear leaders. So it was not my favorite reading. So I'd like to talk about the Belt and Road Initiative according to unofficial Uzbek media. But first, let me contrast it with the official Uzbek media. The Belt and Road Initiative, according to official state media, is completely beneficial for Uzbekistan and the region in general. Uzbek official media, even before 2013, even before the BARI was first announced, tended to praise the many projects sponsored by China that are improving and modernizing Uzbekistan in areas of transportation, communication, energy production, and international trade. And here, I don't know how many joint visits there have been by the president of China to Uzbekistan and the other Central Asian states, but there have been a great number. So, again, what is very typical of Uzbek media today is this. This is typical of the celebratory newspaper articles, and in this one, they're marking the completion of one of the longest train tunnels in Uzbekistan, a project undertaken with the financial support of a Chinese bank and completed by a Chinese construction company. The tunnel provides direct and more immediate access to a critical shipping center. So think back over the last few months, and if you do, during these past several months, one of the main issues has been the persecution of China's Turkic Muslim population in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Republic. It's received increasing attention and, in some cases, condemnation. Not so in Uzbek media, which continues to laud China's role in the region. A November 2018 article in the main newspaper, Word of the People, announced the completion of a new cement plant, or we're back to the celebrating factories and completion of cement plants. This was a project supported by the Chinese government. Again, recently, in January, an article was published which features a very smiling President Mirziyoyev of Uzbekistan, who was attending a ceremony on the erection of a new statue of Confucius in Samarkand, and increased opportunities for Uzbek students to learn Chinese. Again, this was a Chinese-funded project. Similarly, the main government newspaper published an article emphasizing the importance of fostering greater intercultural relations among Uzbek and Chinese youth leaders. In early January of this year, this main newspaper published an interview with the ambassador of China in Tashkent, the capital of Uzbekistan. The ambassador proudly proclaimed the great progress that Uzbekistan was achieving through BARI. She commented that during the previous year, trade volume between the two nations had reached a new historic record. In the previous 3 years, she continued, China had become Uzbekistan's principal economic partner. Trade, she added, had increased by 16% compared to the previous year. She mentioned that there were over 1,000 companies and manufacturers in Uzbekistan receiving funding, operating in Uzbekistan, receiving critical funding through the Chinese government. I hope, she concluded in her remarks, that economic growth between China and Uzbekistan will continue its success. Conspicuous by its absence, however, during this interview was the issue of China's repression and arbitrary arrest of large numbers of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Neither Uzbekistan nor the governments of Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, or Kyrgyzstan have expressed concern about the fate of this population in neighboring Xinjiang, a small percentage of whom are in fact Kazakh, Kyrgyz, Tajik, and Uzbek. So what I'd like to talk now about is this rising criticism of the Chinese government and the BARI that currently appears in some Uzbek social media. True, for us to have a complete understanding of this criticism, we would need to examine sources in each of the region's main languages. But I believe that we can gain some understanding of this criticism by examining website materials that are mainly published in Uzbek. For my survey, I've been monitoring various Uzbek language websites and blogs, in addition to relevant Twitter and Facebook accounts. All of these social media are, as you would expect, unaffiliated with the Central Asian governments and have often been blocked and denounced by government authorities. Relying primarily upon Uzbek language media is not intended to imply that Uzbeks are somehow in the forefront of a nascent anti-BARI movement. That's not the case. As will become apparent, the websites in this review are critical of the Chinese government and the Central Asian governments. I have to say that these websites, while raising important issues and concerns, do contain some comments and images that are unfortunately anti-Chinese and should be condemned as racist. So, what are these websites criticizing? This is from a few years ago and appears in an online journal. In this cartoon, we see a Chinese military official actually meeting with his Uzbek counterpart. We can see that through his, what's that called? Yes, Ministry of Internal Affairs. So the Chinese official says, and unfortunately the guy blocked out that part, but we need your help in crushing the Uyghurs. And the Uzbek responds, thank you, my Chinese elder brother. Let us destroy them for you. There are a few other features here that I'd like to point out. One is, and this actually, I consulted an Uzbek language expert, which was a 16-year-old girl on the internet in Tashkent. And she said to me that this phrase, Boringizga shukur, is the type of phrase that a child would use to express appreciation to one's parent. He has his hand on his heart. These are all gestures of humility, but certainly the power differential becomes very clear through this cartoon. So this issue, the persecution of Uyghurs, is the preeminent issue in these online websites. After the demise of the Soviet Union and the rise of the 5 newly independent Central Asian countries, there was enormous economic problems throughout the region. High rates of unemployment, hyperinflation, the inability of the Central Asian governments really to jumpstart as capitalist nations. All of this meant that Central Asians left. They left migrating to Russia and the Ukraine in search of employment. I'll be honest with you, I haven't kept up with the migration issue, but my understanding is that this pattern has decreased somewhat, but we still have large numbers of Uzbeks, Tajiks, and Kyrgyz heading to Russia and the Ukraine for work, the work being mainly low-wage positions. Some rural parts of Central Asia have seen a dramatic decrease in the number of young men. According to an earlier study, at least 10% of the Uzbek labor force worked in Russia. In a World Bank study in 2012, the total number of remittances sent by Tajik labor migrants to Tajikistan exceeded 3.3 billion, and about nearly equal to the Tajikistan GDP. We see a similar pattern in Kyrgyzstan. Many people relying upon remittances from Kyrgyz citizens abroad. So throughout these websites, the persistent lack of employment within the Central Asian states is a major issue. Has the BARI alleviated this problem? According to these websites, China's economic policies are displacing the indigenous workforce, forcing Central Asian workers to continue their employment quests abroad. In these websites, you see a constant fear, the fear of China's expansion, the fear of continued impoverishment and marginalization. So this is from one of the main websites, We Oppose China Expansion. And this is typical of the imagery they use of large numbers of Chinese workers. You see that all throughout their website. For Central Asians, being reduced to a minority within their own state is in fact not without recent precedent. As a direct result of a state-sponsored famine in the 1930s, Kazakhstan lost at least 1.5 million Kazakh people. In the final official Soviet census from 1989, the percentage of Kazakhs continued to be lower than the Russians living in Kazakhstan. This fear is probably why the Kazakh government in 1998 moved the capital from the country's south to its north, where there was a large Russian population, some of whom were advocating joining the neighboring Russian Republic. So Central Asians need only consider the demographic imbalance between Chinese and Uyghurs in Xinjiang to arouse this type of fear. We are against China's expansion. The name of this website uses these types of demographic and employment issues skillfully to cast a dark shadow over the BARI. In that last sentence there it says, it is the duty of Muslims to resist this Chinese oppression. In January of this year, there were 2 consecutive protests in Kyrgyzstan. What were the demands of these Kyrgyz protesters? It was estimated to be about 200 or 300 people. They demanded a full public accounting of the BAR-related projects. Who was receiving the Chinese money? What were Kyrgyz officials doing with this money? The groups also demanded specific information on the numbers of visas given to Chinese citizens, alleging hundreds of undocumented Chinese workers in Kyrgyzstan. The protesters demanded that the government take action, warning that if the government didn't do anything about it, that they themselves would go into the factories and inspect the documents of Chinese workers. The protests showed the fear that the Kyrgyz are not reaping the benefits of the BARI. rather they are disadvantaged. And this is a very clear slide. There's no work for the Kyrgyz in Kyrgyzstan, but there's work for the Chinese there. So how many visas is the Kyrgyz government making available to Chinese workers? According to the protesters, 75% of all foreign workers were Chinese. They also complained that 60,000 Kyrgyz women had married Chinese men. Some, they alleged, for fraudulent reasons. When the protesters came back, they first appeared on January 18th in the capital, and then they returned on the 18th to protest against Chinese migrants. They demanded that the government follow up on their demands immediately. Let's see. Here are the police getting rid of the protesters in Bishkek. So, one of the protesters said, in our republic there are several hundred, if not more, mainly undocumented Chinese. They work in commercial areas, they work in mining, they work in all kinds of areas. We demand the deportation, their deportation. So that was, one of my questions is the relevance of these websites to movements. In Kyrgyzstan, we have the strongest of these types of movements, but it really is hard to see how we are against China expansion and these movements if they actually have any connection. By 2024, the Kyrgyz government must begin repayment of its China debt. In order to reduce the amount of debt now, the Kyrgyz government is permitting Chinese companies to mine gold and silver within Kyrgyzstan. The response of the website, We Are Against China's Expansion, is clear. Don't let them take your land. And as you can see, a strong fist with the Kyrgyz flag on it, protecting not only the manufacturing land of Kyrgyzstan, but the agricultural land. Probably when international high officials arrive in Tashkent, they're greeted by this type of audience. But here, the web designer turns it on its head. Here, if we don't watch out, we're going to be raising the flag of China. So these websites work on this type of fear constantly. I'm going to go back to a previous one because I found this one very disturbing. This is from an article in the summer in which a delegation of Chinese scholars arrived in Bishkek, historians and linguists, and for these websites, it was unacceptable. It was unacceptable to have the president of Kyrgyzstan actually meeting this delegation, particularly at that time. So in the commentary, it says, haven't you heard the news? Haven't you heard the news that, I don't see my translation here, haven't you heard the news that Muslims are being forced to drink alcohol, that they are forced to eat pork during Ramadan, that our women are being violated, that reading of the Quran is prohibited? Haven't you heard the news? So this is a very damning type of indictment on these websites. They use what is happening in Xinjiang to indict the BARI within Central Asia. As I said, throughout these web pages, the persecution of China's Muslim minority population is a main issue. Religious persecution of Uyghurs and other Muslims is seen as inherent to the BARI. And the next slide This next slide, as disturbing as it is my only Kazakh slide. And according to the text that accompanied this slide, this article, Uyghurs, in a particular part of Xinjiang, were forced to surrender all religious material, all books, Quranic materials, etc., and burn them. So again, we get this conflation of persecution of Muslims and one belt, one road. A recurrent concern in these web pages is the fear of the loss of religious and cultural identity and assimilation. The websites We Are Against China's Expansion, and another one called Kyrgyzstan. We see this concern about Central Asian, Chinese, and Chinese intermarriage. According to one recent article, Uyghur women and girls are being forced to marry Chinese at the request of government authorities in Xinjiang. Neither the Uyghur parents nor local Uyghur officials can intervene against these coercive marriages. The practice, although not independently confirmed, arouses the most bitter condemnation in the comment section of these articles. So from the summer of 2018, Muslim Uyghur girls are being forced to marry Dinsizlar, the atheistic Chinese. In another article which describes the construction of a factory and school building by a Chinese company in Tajikistan, the author alleges a more sinister plan at work. Given the absence of Tajik men who must by economic necessity work in Russia, the Chinese construction workers are seeking out indigent Tajik women with marriage proposals to have these, quote, atheists, and that's one of the kinder names used in these articles, seeking out Muslim girls is just too horrible, according to these websites. So these websites repeatedly emphasize China's expansion as posing an imminent danger to Central Asia's religious and cultural identity. So as many of you are aware, the government of China admitted a few months ago the existence of prisons or vocational training centers, as was their preferred title, where many Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslim minorities are being detained without legal trial. There has been, on the internet, a Me Too Uyghur movement, resulting in daily videos on Facebook and Twitter in which Uyghurs are pleading to the world, to the Chinese government, for information about the disappearance of their relatives. All of these Uyghurs are living abroad in Turkey, Germany, United States, and Canada. But for the first time in Central Asia's modern history, Kazakhs and Kyrgyz have openly expressed concern about the arrest and imprisonment of their relatives living in neighboring Xinjiang. And they're forming committees. both in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. Human rights organizations which seek to help family members of these prisoners. In some cases, those interviewed are sometimes Kazakhs and Kyrgyz who have been released from prisons in Xinjiang and allowed to immigrate to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. I think last week I was looking at one of these interviews. Actually, it was the Kazakh Human Rights Organization website. They have a wonderful interpreters at this webpage who are interviewing Kazakhs whose relatives have disappeared in Xinjiang. This individual is able to translate from Kazakh into Turkish and Kazakh into English. So if you would like kind of an immersion in this issue, go to this website of the Kazakh Human Rights Organization. But in one of the interviews, the young Kazakh man explained that he too had been in prison in Xinjiang for a year, released, and then allowed to immigrate to Kazakhstan. The only problem was that his Chinese, and get this, his Chinese wife was then in prison in Xinjiang. And he had not seen their infant son who was placed in a orphanage. So, what I would like to do is show a brief video that I think summarizes the issues that we've been discussing. So, technician, I'm going to double click on this, and I must be doing something wrong already. Just want to stop it. And go back to the main thing. Yeah, so this video purports to show an incident in which a Kyrgyz community woke up one day and discovered that their land, or land adjacent to them, had been leased to a Chinese mining company. And they were protesting. And the men you saw in blue uniforms were Kyrgyz police who were sent to disperse the crowd. So this was on a number of these websites and Facebook pages. And it has all of the elements that we've been discussing. This fear of the loss of sovereignty, the loss of control over their own resources, the fear that your local government officials are in fact complicit in in your own exploitation. So it has, the reason I like the video is it encompasses all of these, the whole discourse, the whole critical discourse that we see throughout these. All right, you're sitting there and saying, well, what is the significance of these websites? Do they translate into a movement? Or are they highly peripheral? I don't know how to answer that question. If they are representative of something that's percolating out there, or is it best represented by an individual like this, whom I found, Umar Ozbek, I found on Facebook several months ago. And he has been very critical of developments in Xinjiang. He is one of those Central Asian migrants, originally from Kyrgyzstan, couldn't find work. He moved to Russia. And while in Russia, he's taken up this issue. And on December 13th, he went to the Chinese embassy in Moscow with 2 other individuals. So despite his efforts on Facebook to rally Turkic Muslim people in Moscow to come, only 3 showed up. So I think in some ways I have to acknowledge that he is a metaphor for this activity on these websites. It is easy to dismiss what is going on these websites, but the websites do communicate some very important issues that, if not resolved, will make these websites closer to reality for the BARI. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for that, Shawn. Just one fact that reinforces a point about the economic dimensions here. The figures I have correspond to what Shawn presented about remittances from Russia to Central Asian countries. The 2 countries that I happen to have data for, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, these remittances in recent years have been between $2.5 and $3.5 billion a year, and in each of those cases, it exceeds each country's bilateral trade with China, those remittances. So there's an interesting complementarity here of their interdependence with China economically and their interdependence with Russia economically. They are both very intense, but almost completely in separate spheres. The other thing that I would note is that Central Asian Chinese interdependence goes beyond the BRI initiative. If you look at Chinese petroleum engagement in Central Asia, this goes now back a decade and a half at least. It's quite intensive, it's very important, and it's on a parallel separate track from BRI.